The morning sun cast long shadows across the overgrown estate as James stepped out of his old pickup truck. At 25, he had calloused hands and dreams bigger than his small town could hold. The job posting had been simple. Groundskeeper needed for private estate, experience preferred but not required. What he found when he drove through those iron gates was nothing like he expected. Weeds choked what had once been flower beds. Vines crawled up the sides of a magnificent old house, their tendrils reaching toward broken gutters. Ancient oak trees stood like forgotten sentinels, their branches heavy with neglect. But James saw something different. Where others might see decay, he saw potential. Where others saw work, he saw opportunity. Mrs. Henderson, the estate manager, was a stern woman in her 60s who wore her gray hair in a tight bun. She walked him around the property that first day, her sensible shoes crunching on gravel paths that disappeared into tall grass. "The family lives abroad," she explained, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had managed this place for decades. "They bought this property 5 years ago but rarely visit. They want the grounds maintained, nothing fancy. Just keep it from falling apart completely." James nodded, though his mind was already racing with possibilities. The property stretched for acres, rolling hills dotted with old buildings that told stories of a different time. A greenhouse sat empty, its glass panels clouded with age but still intact. Behind the main house, terraced gardens descended toward a small pond that reflected the sky like a mirror. "What kind of budget do I have for supplies?" James asked, running his hand along a stone wall that separated different sections of the garden. Mrs. Henderson handed him a set of keys. "Within reason. Keep receipts for everything. The family is generous but not wasteful." She paused at a wooden gate that led to what might have been a vegetable garden once upon a time. "There's a cottage on the property where the previous groundskeeper lived. You're welcome to use it if you want. Saves on commute time." The cottage was small but clean, with windows that looked out over the gardens James would soon call his domain. That first night, he sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, planning his approach. He had studied agriculture in college, spent summers working at nurseries, but nothing had prepared him for the sheer scope of what lay before him. He started with the basics, clearing pathways so he could actually walk through the property without fighting through brambles, identifying plants that had survived years of neglect, separating the valuable from the invasive. Some days he worked until his back ached and his hands bled through his gloves, but every evening brought visible progress. The first major project was the rose garden. Hidden beneath years of overgrowth, James discovered dozens of heritage roses, their roots still strong despite their wild appearance. He spent weeks carefully pruning, feeding, and training them back onto their supports. When they bloomed that first spring, the fragrance could be smelled from the main house, Mrs. Henderson noticed. "The family will be pleased," she said during one of her weekly check-ins. They specifically mentioned wanting to preserve any historical plantings. Historical plantings. The phrase stuck with James as he worked. This wasn't just any estate. The bones of the garden suggested this place had once been something special. The way the paths curved, the placement of specimen trees, the remains of what had been elaborate flower beds. Everything spoke of careful planning by someone who understood both beauty and function. He began researching at the local library, poring over old maps and property records. The estate had been built in the 1800s, though the original owners seemed to change every few decades. Each family had left their mark on the landscape. Victorian flower beds gave way to more natural plantings from the early 1900s. A section near the back of the property showed signs of having been a working farm at some point. The more James learned about the land, the more connected he felt to it. He started bringing his lunch outside, eating under the shade of trees that had been saplings when his great-grandparents were young. He learned to read the weather in the way morning light hit the greenhouse. He could tell when rain was coming by how the old oak trees swayed in the wind. Local suppliers got to know him by name. The seed store owner would set aside varieties he thought James might like. The nursery owner started calling when interesting plants came in. James had developed a reputation as someone who could bring anything back to life, who saw potential where others saw only problems. Year after year, the estate transformed. What had been wilderness became a showcase of careful cultivation. James installed a drip irrigation system that watered efficiently without waste. He built raised beds for vegetables, their precise rows a study in both function and form. He coaxed fruit trees back to productivity and established cutting gardens that provided flowers for the main house, even though no one seemed to live there. The work was physical, demanding, sometimes frustrating. Plants died despite his best efforts. Weather destroyed months of progress in a single storm. Equipment broke at the worst possible moments. But James found a peace in the rhythm of the seasons, in the reliable cycle of planting and harvest, growth and dormancy. He rarely saw Mrs. Henderson anymore, except for their monthly meetings to review expenses and discuss larger projects. The family, whoever they were, seemed pleased with his work. Bonuses appeared in his paycheck after particularly successful seasons. When he proposed expanding the greenhouse operation, approval came back within days, but questions nagged at him. Who were these mysterious owners? Why buy such a beautiful property and never visit? Sometimes he found evidence that someone had been there. Fresh tire tracks in the gravel, lights on in the main house that hadn't been there the day before. But he never saw anyone, never heard voices or cars arriving. 20 years passed like seasons, each one building on the last. James had become something more than a groundskeeper. He was a curator of living art, a keeper of stories told in soil and stone. The estate had become his life's work, and he couldn't imagine doing anything else. Standing in the morning light, surrounded by gardens that responded to his care like old friends, James felt a satisfaction that came from work well done. He didn't know that his simple job as a groundskeeper was about to become something much more complicated, much more meaningful than he had ever imagined. The first strange thing James noticed was the flowers. Not the ones he planted or tended, but fresh bouquets that appeared overnight in a small garden area he had never been asked to maintain. White lilies usually. Sometimes roses that didn't come from his own carefully cultivated bushes. They would appear on what looked like a small memorial stone, weathered and old, tucked away in a corner of the property he rarely visited. At first he assumed Mrs. Henderson was placing them there. Maybe the previous property owners had lost someone and she was honoring their memory. It seemed like the kind of thoughtful gesture she might make without mentioning it. But when he asked her about it during their monthly meeting, she looked genuinely puzzled. Flowers? I don't know anything about flowers being placed anywhere. Are you sure they're fresh? She adjusted her glasses and made a note on her clipboard. Perhaps someone from town is visiting. Sometimes people remember old connections to properties. James let it go, but the flowers kept appearing. Always fresh, always carefully arranged. Someone was coming onto the property regularly and he never saw them. He started paying more attention to his surroundings, looking for signs of visitors he might have missed. That's when he noticed the deliveries. Twice a month a truck would arrive with supplies he hadn't ordered. Not just gardening supplies, but specific plants, specialized fertilizers, even tools he had mentioned needing in passing conversation with Mrs. Henderson. Everything was always paid for in advance, delivered with invoices that showed no company name, just a post office box number. I thought you were ordering these things, Mrs. Henderson said when he brought it up. The family has been very generous about expanding the gardening budget. They seem pleased with your work, but I never place these orders. Someone else is choosing exactly what I need, sometimes before I even know I need it. Mrs. Henderson frowned, flipping through her papers. The family works through various assistants and services. Maybe one of them is anticipating your needs. Wealthy people often have staff who handle details like that. It was a reasonable explanation, but it didn't feel right. How would some distant assistant know that he needed a specific type of pruning shear for the old grapevines? How would they know to order the exact variety of heirloom tomato seeds he had been hoping to try? Someone was paying very close attention to his work, closer attention than seemed normal for absentee property owners. The mystery deepened when James decided to research the property more thoroughly. What he had found at the library years ago was basic information: ownership records, property boundaries, tax assessments. But now he dug deeper, spending his days off at the county courthouse, the historical society, even driving to the state archives when he could manage it. The story that emerged was complicated and troubling. The estate had indeed been built in the 1800s, but not by wealthy industrialists or merchant families as he had assumed. The original owners had been plantation owners. The beautiful grounds he tended so carefully had once been maintained by enslaved people. The terraced gardens, the stone walls, the carefully planned landscape, all of it had been built by people who were forced to work without pay, who lived and died on this land without ever owning a piece of it. James felt sick reading the old records. Documents listed enslaved people by name, age, and monetary value. Bills of sale treated human beings like livestock. Estate inventories included people alongside furniture and farming equipment. The beautiful memorial stone where the flowers appeared? It sat in what had once been the slave quarters, in a section of the property that historical maps showed as residential buildings for enslaved families. The more he learned, the more questions arose about the current owners. Who buys a former plantation and keeps their identity completely secret? Why purchase property with such a dark history and never visit it? James started to wonder if the mysterious family felt guilty about the land's past, if they were trying to do something good by maintaining it, but couldn't face the reality of what it had once been. He found himself working differently after learning the history. Every stone wall took on new meaning, knowing that enslaved hands had built it. The old oak trees became witnesses to suffering he could barely imagine. The terraced gardens that he had always admired for their engineering and beauty now seemed like monuments to exploitation, but the work continued. Plants still needed water, paths still needed maintenance, seasons still turned regardless of human history. James threw himself into his tasks with renewed dedication, feeling somehow responsible for honoring the people who had worked this land before him. If he was going to tend their former home, he would do it with the respect and care they had never been allowed to give their own work. The deliveries became more frequent and more specific. Someone was definitely watching his work closely. When he started a project to restore what had been the kitchen garden near the old slave quarters, supplies arrived within days. Heirloom vegetables that would have grown in that location during the 1800s, tools appropriate for traditional preservation methods. Even books about historical gardening techniques appeared in packages addressed to him but with no return address. James began to suspect that someone was not just supporting his work, but guiding it. The mystery patron seemed to want the property, restored not just to beauty but to historical accuracy. Every delivery suggested deep knowledge about what the estate had been like during its original period. Someone was researching the same history he was, but from a very different perspective. The flowers at the memorial stone continued to appear, but James started noticing other changes too. Small improvements to areas he hadn't touched. A section of stone wall that had been crumbling was suddenly repaired with stones that matched perfectly. Drainage issues in one area of the garden were fixed overnight, the work done so professionally that James couldn't tell where the old system ended and the new repairs began. Whoever was doing this work knew the property intimately. They understood not just its current condition but its historical layout. They moved around the grounds without being seen, completing projects that required both skill and deep familiarity with the land. James began to feel like he was part of a team he had never met, working alongside invisible partners who shared his commitment to the property, but had their own reasons for staying hidden. The realization hit him gradually. He wasn't the only person who cared deeply about this place. Someone else was investing time, money, and expertise in restoring the estate. Someone who knew its history even better than he did. Someone who felt a connection to this land that went beyond simple ownership or employment. Late at night, sitting on his cottage porch, James would look out over the gardens and wonder who else was looking back. Were they watching from the main house? Did they walk these paths when he wasn't here? Were they as curious about him as he was becoming about them? 20 years of work had given him a sense of ownership over this place that had nothing to do with legal documents. He knew every tree, every stone, every corner where water pooled after rain. But now he realized that his connection to the land, strong as it was, might not be the strongest. Someone else cared about this place enough to invest in it silently, to preserve it secretly, to maintain it through an employee who had no idea he was part of a larger purpose. The questions were becoming too big to ignore. James decided it was time to find some answers. The old carriage house had always been off limits. Mrs. Henderson had mentioned it briefly during James's first tour of the property, explaining that it contained family storage and wasn't part of his maintenance responsibilities. For 20 years he had walked past its heavy wooden doors without giving them much thought. But when she called to say the building needed some repair work before the family stored additional items there, James finally got his chance to see inside. The doors opened with a creak that echoed through the high-ceilinged space. Dust motes danced in shafts of sunlight that filtered through small windows near the roof. The building was larger than it appeared from outside, with a loft area accessible by a sturdy wooden ladder. But what caught James's attention immediately was how empty it seemed for a storage building. A few pieces of furniture sat covered by white sheets. Some old farming equipment lined one wall, tools that looked like they hadn't been used in decades. But for a building that supposedly held family belongings, it felt remarkably hollow. Mrs. Henderson had said he needed to check the roof for leaks and ensure the structure was sound before new items were moved in, so James began his inspection methodically. The roof beams looked solid, though a few tiles had shifted and would need attention. As he climbed into the loft area with his flashlight, James noticed something odd about the floorboards. In one corner, several boards seemed newer than the others, as if they had been replaced recently. When he knelt to examine them more closely, he realized they weren't nailed down like the rest of the floor. They had been carefully fitted to look permanent, but they lifted easily when he pried at them with his utility knife. Underneath was a metal box, small enough to lift but heavy enough to suggest it contained something substantial. James hesitated. This wasn't part of his job. Whatever was hidden here was clearly meant to stay hidden. But his curiosity had been building for months, and here was the first tangible clue about the mysterious owners who had employed him for 2 decades. The box wasn't locked. Inside, wrapped in protective plastic, were documents and photographs that made James's hands shake as he lifted them out. The first thing he saw was a family tree, hand-drawn on heavy paper, with names and dates going back to the 1800s. At the top of the tree were names he recognized from his historical research, the enslaved people who had lived and worked on this property. But the family tree didn't end in the past. Lines extended down through generations, through children, and grandchildren, leading to names from the 20th and 21st centuries. At the bottom of the tree, in careful handwriting, was a name that made James sit down hard on the loft floor: Dr. Victoria Washington Adams. The documents told a story that reframed everything James thought he knew about his job. Birth certificates, death certificates, marriage licenses, and adoption papers created a chain of evidence linking the enslaved families of the 1800s to people living today. School records showed children who had been separated from their families during slavery, some of whom had been adopted by other families and given new names. Military records tracked descendants who had served in various wars. Professional licenses and degrees showed family members who had become teachers, doctors, lawyers, and business owners, despite the obstacles placed in their paths. At the center of it all was Dr. Victoria Washington Adams, a surgeon who lived 3 states away. According to the documents, her great-great-grandmother had been born in slavery on this very property. Her family had been scattered after the Civil War, with some members taking new names and moving to different states. It had taken Dr. Washington Adams years of research to piece together her family's story and trace their connection back to this specific estate. The photographs were even more powerful than the documents. Pictures from the 1800s showed enslaved families posed formally for the camera, their faces serious and dignified despite their circumstances. Later photos tracked the descendants through different eras: children in school uniforms, soldiers in World War II gear, graduation pictures from colleges and universities, wedding photos spanning generations. The final photos in the collection showed Dr. Washington Adams herself, a woman in her 50s with intelligent eyes and her great-great-grandmother's distinctive cheekbones. But the most shocking discovery was a folder labeled Estate Restoration Project. Inside were detailed plans for transforming the property into a memorial and educational center. Architectural drawings showed the main house converted into a museum, with exhibits telling the complete story of the families who had lived and worked on the land. Garden plans detailed how different areas of the property would be restored to show various periods of its history. There were budgets, timelines, and correspondence with historians, architects, and educational consultants. James realized he had been working on this project for 20 years without knowing it. Every improvement he had made, every area he had restored, every historically accurate plant he had cultivated, it was all part of Dr. Washington Adams's vision to honor her ancestors and educate visitors about the true history of the plantation. She had been guiding his work from a distance, supporting his efforts through anonymous deliveries and strategic funding, while she worked to put together the legal and financial framework for the Memorial Center. Letters in the folder revealed her internal struggle. She wrote about the difficulty of inheriting wealth that had come from her family's oppression, about the responsibility she felt to use that inheritance wisely. She described her decision to purchase the property quietly, without revealing her connection to it, because she wanted time to research and plan before making her intentions public. She had been afraid that revealing herself too early might complicate the project or create unwanted attention before she was ready to handle it. But the most personal documents were letters she had written but never sent, addressed to the groundskeeper. In them, she thanked him for his dedication to the land, for treating it with respect and care even though he didn't know its significance to her family. She wrote about watching from a distance as he transformed the property, about her amazement at how he seemed to intuitively understand what the gardens needed. She described her own visits to the property, always careful to come when he wasn't there, to place flowers at her ancestors' memorial, and to see the progress he was making. In the final letter, dated just 3 months earlier, she wrote about her decision to reveal herself. The Memorial Center project was ready to move forward. The legal paperwork was complete, the funding was in place, and the educational partnerships were established. It was time to bring James into the project as a full partner, to let him know that his 2 decades of work had been part of something much larger than simple property maintenance. James sat in the dusty loft as afternoon faded to evening, surrounded by the evidence of a connection he had never imagined. The mysterious owners weren't distant wealthy people with guilty consciences. The person who had been supporting his work, guiding his efforts, and investing in the property's restoration was someone who had a deeper connection to this land than he could ever have. She was the descendant of people who had been forced to work this soil without recognition or compensation, and she had chosen to honor their memory by creating something beautiful and educational from their suffering. The flowers at the memorial stone weren't placed by a paid caretaker or a guilty property owner. They were placed by a woman honoring her great-great-grandmother, who had lived and died on this property as a slave but whose descendant had become a successful surgeon with the UAO resources to buy back the land her family had been forced to work without owning. As James carefully returned the documents to their box and replaced the floorboards, he realized his simple job as a groundskeeper was about to become something entirely different. He had been tending a memorial without knowing it, caring for sacred ground without understanding its significance. Tomorrow he would have to decide how to handle this knowledge, how to approach Dr. Washington Adams, and how to become part of a project that had been growing around him for 20 years. The sun was setting as James climbed down from the loft, casting long shadows across the gardens he had spent his adult life perfecting. Every plant, every path, every carefully tended area looked different now that he knew the truth. He wasn't just a groundskeeper anymore. He was a caretaker of history, a keeper of stories, and soon, he hoped, a partner in something that would honor the past while educating the future. James spent 3 sleepless nights after discovering the documents in the carriage house. He would start to fall asleep, then jolt awake as the implications of what he had learned crashed over him again. By the 4th day, he had made his decision. He would wait by the memorial stone that evening, hoping that Dr. Washington Adams would come to place fresh flowers as she had been doing for months. The sun was setting behind the old oak trees when he saw her car pull through the gates. A silver sedan that moved slowly along the gravel drive, its driver clearly familiar with the property's layout. James watched from his position near the memorial as the car parked by the main house, and a woman got out, carrying a small bouquet of white lilies. She was smaller than he had expected from her photographs, probably in her mid-50s with graying hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She wore jeans and a sweater, clothes chosen for comfort rather than style, but there was something in the way she moved, a quiet confidence that suggested she was used to making important decisions and handling difficult situations. Dr. Washington Adams walked directly toward the memorial stone, so focused on her purpose that she didn't notice James waiting in the shadow of the oak tree until she was almost there. When she saw him, she stopped abruptly, her hand tightening on the flower stems. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice steady but cautious. "I didn't know anyone was here. I can come back another time." "Dr. Washington Adams," James said quietly, stepping into the fading light. "I think we need to talk." The flowers fell from her hand as she stared at him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then she nodded slowly, as if she had been expecting this conversation for years and was almost relieved that it was finally happening. "You know," she said, "it wasn't a question. I found the documents in the carriage house. I was doing repairs like Mrs. Henderson asked, and I found where you had hidden your research." James bent to pick up the scattered lilies, handing them back to her. "I know who you are. I know why you bought this property. And I know why you've been supporting my work all these years." Dr. Washington Adams took the flowers but didn't move toward the memorial stone. Instead, she looked around at the gardens James had spent 20 years perfecting, her eyes taking in details that most people would miss. The way the vegetable beds were laid out to match historical planting patterns. The heritage varieties of roses that would have grown here in the 1800s. The carefully maintained paths that followed the original estate design. "You've done beautiful work," she said finally. "When I first bought this property, I wasn't sure it could be restored. Too much had been lost, too much damaged. But you've brought it back to life in ways I never imagined possible. You guided most of it. All those deliveries, all those perfectly timed supplies. You were watching my work and making sure I had what I needed to do it right." She smiled, though there were tears in her eyes. "I was trying to stay invisible while still supporting what you were doing. I wasn't ready to reveal myself, to explain why this place mattered so much to me. I needed time to research, to plan, to figure out how to honor my family's story without turning their suffering into a tourist attraction." They walked together toward the memorial stone, their steps crunching softly on the gravel path James maintained so carefully. In the fading light, the gardens around them seemed to hold their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. "Tell me about your great-great-grandmother," James said as they reached the memorial. "Tell me about the woman whose grave I've been maintaining without knowing it." Dr. Washington Adams knelt by the stone, placing the lilies carefully at its base. "Her name was Ruth Washington. She was born here in 1842 and lived her entire life on this property. She worked in the main house as a cook, and later in the gardens. After the Civil War ended, she stayed here for several more years, because she didn't have anywhere else to go. This memorial stone marks where she's buried, along with other members of our family who lived and died here." James knelt beside her, touching the weathered stone that had been just another garden feature to him for so long. "How did you find out about this place? How did you trace your family back here?" "It took me 15 years of research. Family stories passed down through generations, church records, census data, estate documents. My grandmother always talked about ancestors who had lived on a big plantation in this area, but she didn't know exactly where. When I finally located the property and learned it was for sale, I felt like I had to buy it. I couldn't let someone else own the land where my family had suffered and died." The full implications of the situation were beginning to hit James. This wasn't just about historical preservation or memorial gardens. Dr. Washington Adams had spent significant money to buy the property where her ancestors had been enslaved, and she had been paying him to maintain it for 20 years without him knowing the true purpose of his work. "I feel like I should apologize," he said. "All these years I was just doing my job. I didn't know I was taking care of your family's burial ground. I didn't know this place meant something so personal to you. Don't apologize. You've done exactly what needed to be done. You've treated this land with respect and care. You've preserved its beauty and maintained its dignity. My ancestors would be proud to see how you've cared for their home." Dr. Washington Adams pulled out a folder from her car and showed James the detailed plans for the Memorial and Educational Center. The drawings and documents he had seen in the carriage house were just part of a much larger vision. The project would include guided tours, educate, facilities for people tracing their own family histories, and gardens that would demonstrate both the horror of slavery and the resilience of the people who survived it. "I want you to be the head curator of the Memorial Gardens," she said, watching his face for his reaction. "You know this land better than anyone. You've already restored so much of its historical character. I can't imagine anyone else taking care of the educational gardens when we open to the public." James was quiet for several minutes, processing the magnitude of what she was offering. His simple job as a groundskeeper would become something much more complex and meaningful. He would be responsible not just for maintaining beautiful gardens, but for telling the stories of real people who had lived and died on this land. He would be educating visitors about one of the darkest, chapters in American history while also celebrating the strength and resilience of the people who had survived that history. There's something I need to tell you, he said finally. Learning about what this place really was, finding out about your family and the people who lived here as slaves, it's changed how I see everything. Every stone wall, every old tree, every path I've maintained. I can't just see them as garden features anymore. They're monuments to people who suffered here, but also to people who survived and built families and created legacies despite everything that was done to them. Dr. Washington Adams nodded. That's exactly how I hoped you would feel. That's why I knew you were the right person to help me turn this place into something that honors their memory properly. As full darkness settled over the property, they continued talking about the project, about the challenges of presenting difficult history in a way that would educate, rather than simply shock visitors. They talked about the responsibility they both felt to get the story right, to honor the people who had lived here without sanitizing or romanticizing their experiences. When Dr. Washington Adams finally prepared to leave, she shook James's hand formally. I'll call Mrs. Henderson tomorrow and explain the situation. From now on, you'll be working directly with me and the project team. We have a lot of work to do before we can open to the public, but I think we can create something really special here, something that makes sure these stories are never forgotten. James watched her drive away, then stood alone in the gardens he had tended for 20 years. Tomorrow everything would be different. He would no longer be just a groundskeeper maintaining a beautiful property. He would be a partner in creating a living memorial to people whose stories deserved to be told, whose lives had meaning beyond their suffering, and whose descendants had found ways to transform tragedy into education and healing. The weight of that responsibility felt heavy, but also hopeful. For the first time since discovering the truth about the property, James felt ready for the work ahead. 6 months after that evening conversation by the memorial stone, James stood at the entrance of what was now officially called the Heritage Gardens and Memorial Center. The transformation had been remarkable, though much of the work had involved revealing rather than changing what already existed. The gardens James had maintained for 20 years provided the perfect foundation for telling the complete story of the people who had lived and worked on this land Dr. Washington Adams had kept her promise about, involving him in every aspect of the project. Together, they had worked with historians, architects, and educators to create something that was both beautiful and meaningful. The Memorial Center wasn't just about preserving the past, it was about connecting that past to the present in ways that could inspire visitors to think differently about history, family, and resilience. The main house had been converted into a museum and education center, but the real heart of the project was outside, in the gardens where James felt most at home. Different areas of the property now told different parts of the story, with carefully designed paths that guided visitors through a journey from slavery to freedom to reconciliation. The Memorial Garden, where Ruth Washington and other enslaved family members were buried, had become the emotional center of the entire project. James had worked with a sculptor to create new markers that honored each person by name, along with others whose names had been lost to time, but whose presence was acknowledged through carefully chosen plantings. The white lilies that Dr. Washington Adams had been bringing for months now grew permanently in the garden, tended by James and volunteers who had joined the project. But the memorial wasn't just about sadness and loss. Other sections of the property celebrated the achievements of the families who had survived slavery and built successful lives for their descendants. A freedom garden showcased plants that had been grown by newly freed slaves who stayed in the area after the Civil War, along with information about the businesses they had started, the schools they had built, and the communities they had created. The most popular area with visitors was what James called the Learning Garden, where school groups could participate in hands-on activities that taught them about both historical and modern agriculture. Students planted vegetables using traditional techniques, learned about the plants that had sustained enslaved families, and participated in discussions about how food and farming connected to broader issues of freedom, labor, and economic justice. James had discovered that he enjoyed teaching as much as gardening. Groups of children would follow him through the various garden areas, asking questions about everything from soil composition to family genealogy. He found that young people were especially interested in the detective work that had gone into tracing Dr. Washington Adams' family history, and several school groups had started their own family research projects after visiting the Memorial Center. Adult visitors often had more complex reactions. Some came because they were researching their own family histories and hoped to learn techniques for tracing ancestors who had been enslaved. Others came because they were descendants of slave owners and were trying to understand and acknowledge their families' roles in the system of slavery. Still others came simply because they wanted to learn more about a part of American history that hadn't been taught well in their own education. Dr. Washington Adams spent at least 2 days a week at the Memorial Center, working with visitors who were doing genealogical research and consulting with other communities that wanted to create similar projects. She had become something of an expert in the complicated process of researching enslaved families, and she regularly spoke at conferences about the techniques she had developed for tracing family connections across centuries of incomplete records. The partnership between James and Dr. Washington Adams had evolved into something neither of them had expected. She brought the historical knowledge and the personal connection to the land, while he brought the practical skills and the deep understanding of the property itself. But they had also learned from each other in ways that went beyond their specific expertise. James had developed a much deeper appreciation for the complexity of historical research and the importance of getting details right when telling other people's stories. Dr. Washington Adams had gained a new understanding of how physical spaces could be used to teach history in ways that were more powerful than books or lectures alone. They had also faced challenges neither of them had anticipated. Some visitors came with preconceived ideas about slavery that were difficult to address through garden tours and educational exhibits. Some community members had been suspicious of the project, worried that it would present a one-sided view of history or that it would make their area look bad to outsiders. But the most difficult moments had also led to some of the most meaningful conversations. James remembered a visit from a group of teenagers from the local high school, one of whom challenged the entire premise of the Memorial Center. "Why are we supposed to feel guilty about something that happened so long ago?" the student had asked. "None of us owned slaves. None of us were slaves. Why can't we just move on?" The question had led to a 2-hour discussion about the difference between guilt and responsibility, about how historical events continued to shape present-day conditions, and about the importance of understanding the past in order to make better decisions in the future. By the end of the visit, the same student was asking about volunteer opportunities and wondering if his own family's history might connect to the area in ways he had never considered. Final programs for schools. Research of stories like that reminded James why the work mattered. The Memorial Center wasn't just about honoring people who had died long ago. It was about helping living people understand their connections to each other and to the land they shared. It was about using the specific story of one family and one property to illuminate larger truths about American history, human resilience, and the ongoing work of building a more just society. The success of the project had also brought new opportunities. Other communities had reached out to Dr. Washington Adams and James for advice about their own memorial projects. Universities were sending student groups to study their model. The Memorial Center had been featured in magazines and documentaries as an example of how historical sites could be used for education and healing, rather than just tourism. But for James, the most satisfying aspect of the work remained the daily routine of caring for the gardens themselves. Every morning he still walked the paths he had maintained for 20 years, checking on plants, adjusting irrigation systems, and planning seasonal changes. The difference now was that every task was connected to a larger purpose, and every garden bed told part of a story that visitors could take with them when they left. Standing in the early morning light, surrounded by gardens that now served as a living textbook of American history, James reflected on how completely his life had changed since that day he had discovered the documents in the carriage house. He was still doing work he loved, still caring for plants and maintaining beautiful outdoor spaces. But now that work was connected to something much larger than himself. The Memorial Center had become a place where past and present met, where individual stories connected to larger historical narratives, and where the work of understanding and healing could take place in a setting of beauty and growth. James knew that Ruth Washington and the other people buried in the memorial garden would be proud of what their descendant had created on the land where they had lived and died. More importantly, He knew that the educational work happening at the Memorial Center would ensure that their stories would never be forgotten, and that future generations would understand both the horrors they had endured and the strength they had shown in surviving them. As the first school bus of the day turned into the drive, bringing another group of young visitors to learn from the gardens he tended, James smiled and prepared to begin another day of teaching. Learning and growing, not just plants but understanding,